Hi, I'm David Breeden. I'm a territory manager with Husqvarna. I've been with Husqvarna for 20 years now. I just celebrated my 20-year anniversary this month, actually, on the 19th. I am also a certified arborist. I'm involved in the tree care industry around Atlanta. Work closely with a lot of tree care companies and go to a lot of functions with the Georgia Arborist Association. So I have a passion for tree care and trees and safe operation of chainsaws. So being around this industry for the last 20 years, it's given me an opportunity to meet a lot of people. I've had a lot of great conversations at shows and power equipment dealerships. And when I start talking to somebody about old chainsaws that they own and 20, 30 years old or more, you know, those conversations take me in a lot of different directions. So they talk about how the product's really good and, you know, and that makes everybody feel good. But, you know, after talking to them a while, normally I'll look out in the parking lot and I'll see the truck that they pulled up in. And I say, wow, that's a nice truck you got there. He's like, yeah, I bought that truck new in 1980. I'm like, wow, that truck's, you've had it for a long time. And he's like, yeah, and it's real clean and it looks good and it still drives good. And the conversation seems to go on a little bit further. And finally I look at them and I say, you know, can I ask you a personal question? And they usually say, of course. I say, how long have you been married to your wife? And they'll usually light up and they'll say, oh, we've been married for 30, 40, 50 years. And over the 20 years of having those conversations, I've learned one thing. If you want something to last, whether it's a marriage or whether it's an old truck or even a chainsaw, it requires some maintenance. And it requires maintenance every single day. All of those people that I talk to, they've taken care of their trucks and taken care of their wives and taken care of their chainsaws, which is why they've lasted so long. There's maintenance that's required every day on chainsaw, and we like to call it an RDT program, which is a reduced downtime. Because if you're out working, if you're working production, or if you're just working around your property, you want to get the job done and you don't want delays and equipment's breaking down. So what we always do is we always refer to our owner's manual, right? No, that's never what we do. We usually buy a chainsaw and then we do that on day one and we never know where it is. Every day before I run my chainsaw, I go through a process, and it always starts with the safety features. Each chainsaw today has 3 safety features, no matter what the brand is. And I like to start by checking my chain brake. Chain brake on a chainsaw works a couple of ways. One, it works manually. When the chain brake is engaged, the chain will not turn around the bar. This is when you crank the chainsaw, you have the chain brake engaged. When you're using it and you are walking, you use your chain brake. But when I disengage this, it allows the chain to turn around the bar. So I want to make sure that that's functional. I want to make sure that it's operating properly because I'm going to be using it throughout the day. Part of what I talk about is community chainsaws. If you have a chainsaw and you work for a city, county, some type of municipality, you have saw that somebody else ran the day before. This saw, I'm the only person that's ever run it, so I know what type of life it's had. But you may have a saw that somebody else ran, so it's very important before you operate it to make sure the safety features are on the saw and make sure they work. Another way that chain brakes work is by inertia. So when I'm cutting with the chainsaw, I get a rotational force, which is always going to be in plane with the bar. Depending on how I'm running the saw, that rotational force, if I get it, will always be in plane. So chain brakes are also, they work as hand guards, but most people think if I were to get that rotational force, that my hand is actually going to engage the chain brake. Sometimes that may be the case, but if I'm running the chainsaw on its side like this, there's no way that my hand is going to activate that chain brake. So what happens, the way by design, an inertia chain brake, when the chainsaw gets that rotational force, if it's violent enough, as the bar comes back in this direction towards the operator, the chain brake wants to travel in the opposite direction, which will engage the chain brake and stop the chain. So I can test my inertia chain brake by dropping it on an object to see if that actually works. So I disengage the chain brake, it allows the chain to turn around the bar. I drop it on an object and you see that the chain brake actually engaged. So the next feature on chainsaw is a throttle interlock system. So this is on a lot of different pieces of power equipment that you might have. Basically what this does is this throttle will not activate until my hand is in the driver's seat. So my hand is here. Let's say you're running a chainsaw and you haven't used the chain brake, or a chain brake doesn't work. You're clearing out storm damage, and you put your running chainsaw down and a limb comes up through the handle and hits your throttle. Well, if you didn't have this throttle interlock, it would allow the chainsaw to throttle up and the chain would start spinning and could possibly get into your leg. For some reason, I still see chainsaws in dealerships sitting in the shop that'll have a piece of tape taping the throttle interlock system down. I don't understand why somebody would do that. Overriding this does not make you more productive. It doesn't make you cool. Always make sure that this feature is here and that it's working. So when my hand is here on this rear handle, I can throttle my saw up. The last safety feature is a chain catch. So this one's got a little oil on it, but the chain catch covers the area between the side cover or the clutch cover and the crankcase. The significance here is that it will catch the chain if it derails off the bar while I'm using it. So if I have a chainsaw that has a longer bar, if the chain were to come off the bar, that could easily get into my leg. The chain catch wraps that up and it allows it to slap on this offset handle which is covering my hand. So always check the chain catch on your saw. It could be made out of aluminum. You could have some that are a hard plastic type material, or it could be molded into the crankcase. The goal here is to make it out of something that is less durable than the chain itself, because when the chain comes in contact with it, you want to be able to continue to use the chain. If you look at your saw and you inspect your chain catch, you'll see that it's actually been used. I've seen some of these get knocked off before. When that's the case, it needs to be replaced, and usually they're very easy to replace and they're cost effective to replace. But always check that and make sure that's there, because that is an important safety feature. The next thing I do once I know all my safety features are there, I just want to visually inspect my chainsaw. I want to make sure that there's no fuel leaks, there's no other types of leaks. I don't have any missing hardware. Just a once around to make sure that everything looks okay. I like to say this is the time to look for duct tape. If you have a community saw, somebody might have taped something on here just to get the job done. If there's duct tape on your chainsaw, that's a sign that you need to do a further inspection and see exactly what's going on. During this time, I also any hardware, any screws, I like to make sure that they are tight. One of the things that I talk to a lot of people about, modern chainsaws have very good anti-vibration systems. Older saws, not so much. There's been a lot of research and development in making the chainsaws run smooth. So much so that when you have your hands on the handle, it feels like, you don't feel any vibration at all. A lot of times I'll have people with the saw running put their hand on this top cover to feel how much vibration is in the power head, and then put their hand on the handles and see the difference. It's pretty amazing. And the point I'm trying to make is that if you think that you don't have to check nuts and bolts and things like that, you're going to have things that fall off of your saw. So you have to go around from time to time and tighten those up. And it doesn't take but a second, but just take a tool and go around and make sure, and you'll see that some things are actually loose from time to time. So once I go and do that visual inspection, I'm able to move to my next step, which is my air filter. Now this is very important. If you were to look at that owner's manual that you actually threw away or you're lost, the manufacturer would tell you that this air filter needs to be cleaned every single day before you use your chainsaw. And not many people do that. I mean, that's very good practice, but the air filter is the nose of the chainsaw. So imagine if you had your nose was stuffed up and you had lots of congestion, and I ask you to go run a marathon. It'd be very difficult to run a marathon with congestion and a stopped up nose. Well, this is the nose of the chainsaw, and it can't clean its own nose. It requires me to clean its nose. And so if this saw, the saw I actually have here is 50 cc's, and this chainsaw is gonna run 13,500 RPMs out of the box. So every 60 seconds, 700,000 to 800,000 cc's of air actually pass through this air filter. So it's very important that I keep this clean, because if I want my saw to perform and get the work done, then this has to be clean, and it has to be done daily. If you look at that owner's manual, it'll tell you that you can clean it by simply tapping it out on a hard surface. The reason that's good practice is that's very effective if you do it every single day. That's usually enough. But if you allow this to get dirty, then you have to do a little something different. So most people will grab the air hose and clean this out. And you have to be careful doing that. Usually the pressures are very high, because you know, if you want to remove a rusty lug nut, it takes a lot of PSI. I think the owner's manual says don't use any more than 35 PSI. And 35 PSI is not going to really do much. But you have to be very careful. If you take a air hose and you blow a hole in this flocking, then you're allowing dust and dirt to come through, and it's always going to find a path of least resistance. I like to say, like crooked men and rivers, that's exactly what's going to happen here. It's going to flow into your air filter, get inside of the cylinder of your chainsaw, and then you're going to have a major problem. You're going to have a lack of compression and possibly a catastrophic loss at some point in time. So be careful with air. Don't ever use it to blow from the outside in, because you're simply blowing that dust and debris inside of the air filter. When you crank up the saw, it's going to pull it right into the intake. Blow from inside out, and be very careful with that. If you get a really dirty air filter, you can take these flocked filters and you can clean them with warm soapy water. When you do that, they need at least 24 hours to dry. So if you clean it that way, you need to have a backup filter that you can put into your saw. And I usually keep backups. You know, you've got two types of filters here, and it just depends on the use. Filters are you know, rated based on micron ratings and how small of a particle that the filter can actually keep out. But this is one of the most important things on a chainsaw, is your air filter. And if you're having issues, that's one of the first things that you want to check. So when I get this clean and I put this back in, if you want to use air anywhere up here inside of the saw, the cylinder fins, this is an air-cooled engine, obviously. The design of this cylinder and the design of these fins actually are what allows this chainsaw to dissipate heat. So I don't want a lot of dust and oil and dirt to accumulate under here. So I take my air and I blow all this out. I want to make sure these cylinder fins are clean, and it's going to make my chainsaw run as cool as it possibly can. Here in Georgia over the last couple of weeks, we've had 100-degree temperatures, so that has a huge impact on how your chainsaw runs and performs. So once I have that done, I move to my next step, which is my starter rope. Starter rope, checking and inspecting your starter rope is very important. Let's say you're responding to a storm and once again, you're with the municipality or some type of volunteer organization, and you get out in the middle of the night and you've got a tree in the road and you brought one chainsaw with you and you go to crank it and the rope breaks, okay? Then you either got to drive all the way back to the shop to get that fixed, or you're essentially out of business. So you always want to inspect your rope for any frays or any breaks. And from the manufacturer, you should have about 30 inches of rope, and it should go back into the starter housing like that. You don't want your ropes hanging out here. If that's the case, you need to put some tension on the spring. It should snap back into the case like this. I meet, as I say, I meet a lot of people, and I talk to a lot of guys who can't keep a starter rope in anything. They got starter problems with their chainsaws. They got starter problems with their trimmers, and I don't know that it's the brand. I think it's probably more of them. This is a theory by David, which means that it doesn't carry a whole lot of weight. But I believe the life of a starter system on a chainsaw is directly related to how it gets cranked. So if you're out here cranking your chainsaw like this is not the way that the manufacturer designed this rope to come out. If you're out here, cranking it like this is not the way. And this isn't a video about proper starting, but when I start it the proper way, the rope comes right out of the side cover, right out of the starter housing, and this rope is going to last for a long time. This chainsaw behind me here is a 2011 model. It's got the original rope in it. And I believe that's related to how it's been cranked its entire life. The new technology on chainsaws allows you to tell how many times a saw has actually been cranked. So when I look at saws and I see that they've been cranked 4,000 and 5,000 different times, you can take that and at least multiply that number by 2, sometimes 3 or more, because they don't crank on the first pull. That's a lot of stress that occurs to the starter system and the rope. So it's pretty impressive that all of this will last 15, 20,000 pulls or more. But it'll only do that if you start properly, and then by inspecting this should really could last the life of the chainsaw. So finally, in my 5-step process, I want now to go through the bar, chain, and sprocket. So you're going to see potentially 2 different types of designs on chainsaws. You see what's an outboard clutch, which this chainsaw has, and then the saw behind me has an inboard clutch. So just based on the saw and based on how it gets used primarily, there's some advantages of both. In some cases there's some disadvantages, like in most everything else. Anytime you're handling the chain, you want to make sure you wear gloves for obvious reasons. Chains are sharp, hopefully, and when you're out in the woods and you're running your saw, there's going to be a lot of heat. So we'll get more into that, here in just a second. But it's normal for you to get a lot of dust and dirt and bar oil that accumulates here. This is also another good area where you can take your compressed air and blow all of these things out. You know, I'm checking my bar studs to make sure everything's good. Anything that I want to do to clean this is always good. Anytime you remove this away from the crankcase, you allow it to cool properly while you're operating it. Imagine you're, baking a cake or cookies, doesn't matter what you like to bake, and you set the oven at 350. When I ask people, what they set the oven at, they usually say 350. Imagine you set those cookies in there and you leave the oven on, and then you come back a week later. You can imagine what'll happen. Obviously, you're probably not gonna have a house if you come back a week later, but you would never put cookies in the oven at 350 or any temperature and leave them for a week. The reason I say that is temperatures inside of a bar can get up at least 500 degrees or more. That's if you have a sharp chain. If you have dull chain, temperatures in this bar can get up 700 to 800, possibly 1,000 degrees. So it's very important that you keep your bar rail cleaned out. You can take, there's all types of tools that you can use to do this with, but as you see, I have wood chips and bar and chain oil, had the perfect ingredients for a cake. So at 500 degrees, they will bake into these rails. I have to go in and I have to clean that out. I always go from tip to tail on a bar that has a sprocket nose because I don't want to push that into my sprocket. I want to remove it away from that. So as I get everything cleaned out, there's a couple of other areas that I want to address. On the bar, you have the oil supply holes, and they're on both sides because the bar needs to be rotated to promote even wear. But I've got these oil supply holes, and I need to make sure that I get those cleared because I want oil to travel from the oiler into that hole, and this is where the drive links of the chain actually pull the oil up through the bar rails and I get proper lubrication. So I want to make sure those are clean. If I want to take air on this, it usually makes a mess, but you could certainly take air on the oil supply holes and blow those out. That normally works pretty good. For me, a lot of bars that you see today that have sprocket nose do not have an area to oil them. A lot of manufacturers still do that. This bar does not have that option. I've always essentially just never put any grease in that. I've allowed the bar and chain oil to lubricate the sprocket. I've never had any issues. I know I would tell you if you do decide to grease your sprocket, then you need to do that all the time because you need to push the contaminants out. I've found it that I don't have to do anything, and that's always worked good for me. But whatever you decide is as long as that's working, then I would continue to do it. So since I have my bar cleaned out now, the other thing that I want to do is I want to inspect my sprocket. You're going to see, it's going to be difficult to see in the video, but as I said, this is an outboard clutch. This clutch is separated from the crankcase, and the sprocket is actually located in between the clutch and the crankcase itself. One of the advantages of this is it allows for a chainsaw that's extremely slim, reduces the gyroscopic forces on your hands as you're using the chainsaw for limbing purposes. That's one of the advantages. But my sprocket, you're going to see two types of sprockets. You'll see a spur sprocket. Normally in consumer applications, in a professional chainsaw, you'll see a rim sprocket, and so you want to look for wear. The manufacturers of sprockets say at 25 thousandths of wear, the sprocket needs to be replaced. I was out on a trip in Oregon one time, and actually we were working with an engineer, and he came up with the idea on a rim sprocket to put some witness marks on the sprocket, and when those witness marks are no longer there, that lets you know that the sprocket has 25 thousandths wear, because it was very hard for somebody to know when it was worn and when it needed to be replaced. So if you look on your rim sprocket, it will most of the time, in most cases, almost 100%, have the little witness marks that run east to west. And when you look at that, that's what those are for. And when those are actually missing, you know it's time to replace your sprocket. So my sprocket is good in this case, very little wear. So I want to go back with my bar and chain, and I've rotated my bar, because each time I take a chain off, replace it with a new one, or whether I'm cleaning or doing any maintenance, I always rotate my bar over. Putting a chain back on, one of the things, I've tried to decide why this is, and I think I figured out something. If you are using your chainsaw for removing trees, taking trees that are standing and taking them down, you want to make sure that the chain cutter, the point on your chain cutter, is facing away from the power head out to the tip of the bar. If you take trees that are already down and you want to stand them up, apparently you just reverse the chain, because I still see chainsaws that have the chains on backwards. So apparently there's an application for that. I just haven't been able to use it successfully yet. Obviously that's a joke. Make sure when you're putting your chain back on that you're always putting it on with the point of the cutter facing away from you, or towards the end of the bar. So at this point, I've got a chain this chainsaw has not been ran today, so the chain is not hot. When you're putting a chain back on a chainsaw in the woods and there's a lot of temperature in the bar and the chain, you want to adjust your chain tension a little bit differently, because what we know about metal is that it expands when it gets hot, and when it cools down it fractionally gets a little bit smaller. Not a lot, but some. Metal obviously doesn't stretch. We talk about chain stretching. That's more of rivets in the chain seating and making the chain loop fractionally longer. But as it gets hot, it will get a little larger, and when it cools down, it will shrink. So you want to make sure you don't have too much chain tension on a chain that's hot. One of the things that you get with newer chainsaws is captured bar nuts. And you see, if you've ever been out in the woods and you took your bar and chain off and you lost a bar nut, if you don't have an extra, you may be in trouble. If you lose both of them, you're certainly in trouble. So captured bar nuts are a nice feature on some of today's saws. So I like to put my side cover on and I adjust my chain. I get asked a lot, what proper chain tension is, and that's a very good question. And I'll tell you that chain tension could vary based on bar length. But the way I was taught years ago was, if you want to know what proper chain tension is, get it tight to where you think it needs to be. And then if the chain snaps back into the bar rail, like a guitar string or a banjo string, if you will, and it moves around the bar, then that's good chain tension. I think we need to tighten it up just a little bit more. So I usually loosen the rear bar nut. Some people raise the tip of the bar, some people don't. I used to raise it a lot. Now I don't do that anymore. I think, from what I've learned from Tim, that was what they did a long time ago, because the side covers did not tighten down really good, and the bar had a lot of play in it. So if you didn't hold the tip up and you were using the pulling side of the chain, it would naturally make the chain tension a lot looser. So I don't usually hold the tip up anymore. I just tighten it up to where it thinks it goes. I let gravity help me out. I also see a lot of people putting chains on with the saw line on its side. I've always learned to do it with the saw sitting like this, and I go back to that gravity. I let gravity hold it on the top side of the bar, and I make sure I get it on the sprocket. So I think this is really good chain tension here. Now I tighten up my other bar nut. And I'm ready to go. This entire process takes just a few minutes. I don't always take my bar and chain off. I may be sharpening today. I may take it off. I may be putting a new chain on, but I go through these steps, these 5 steps, before I run my chainsaw. And it takes just a couple of minutes, and I don't have any surprises. I know exactly what to expect. And if you do this on a daily basis, going back to my story in the beginning, your chainsaw is gonna last a long time, and you're gonna get a lot of service out of it.